Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are opening up a file that, honestly, it feels like a movie script.
It really does, yeah.
Like we've got space lasers, spies, a looming apocalypse, and these two old men trying to figure out if they should blow up the world or shake hands. We're talking about the end of the Cold War.
It is the ultimate geopolitical thriller, and I want to flag something right up front here. If you are an IB history student listening to this, grab your notebook.
Oh, absolutely.
Because this deep dive is practically written for you. We aren't just looking at the timeline of events. We are looking at the historiography, the big, messy arguments about why it actually ended the way it did.
Right, because it's not as simple as the Berlin Wall fell and everyone just went home, is it?
Not at all.
We have a pretty massive stack of sources today, and they are kind of all over the place. We've got the neocon perspective, we have the realist defense of the 1970s, some really intense timelines from the terrifying year that was 1983, and notes on what's called the Reagan Victory School.
It's a dense stack. But the core question we're tackling is simple. How did we go from the Second Cold War in the early 80s, where honestly nuclear war felt almost inevitable, to the Soviet Union just dissolving?
Right.
Was it Ronald Reagan's military pressure? Was it Mikhail Gorbachev's internal reforms? Or was it just blind luck?
Well, let's set the scene before we try to answer that, because the sources we're looking at, they paint a pretty grim picture of the early 1980s. Like, if you look at this summit in Geneva in November 1985, the notes describe the atmosphere there as frosty.
Frosty's putting it mildly. I mean, the relationship was in the deep freeze. But then, you fast forward less than 5 years, and the conflict is basically over. No nuclear explosion, just a handshake. That is the mystery we're unpacking today.
To solve it, I feel like we have to rewind a bit. Before we get to the actual end, we have to understand why things fell apart in the first place. I'm talking about the death of détente.
Right, détente. That was the absolute buzzword of the 1970s. It literally means relaxation of tensions. The whole idea was that the U.S. and the USSR could coexist, sign some treaties, lower the temperature.
Yeah.
But by 1980, that idea was dead in the water.
Why, though? Like, what killed it?
Well, if you look at the neoconservative sources in our stack, and again, we're just reporting what the sources argue here, they would tell you that détente was a trap. They argued it was a Soviet deception right from day one.
A deception? Like, the Soviets were pretending to be nice while hiding a dagger behind their back.
That is effectively the argument, yes. The neocons pointed out that while the U.S. was busy signing these treaties and cutting defense budgets, the Soviets were expanding. By 1980, the USSR had achieved nuclear parity.
Right.
They weren't the underdog anymore. They were an equal superpower.
And they weren't just sitting on those nukes either. The notes mention these SS-20 missiles.
Oh, the SS-20s were a complete nightmare for NATO. These were intermediate-range missiles deployed in Eastern Europe. They could hit London or Paris in a matter of minutes, but the catch is they weren't covered by the existing treaties.
Wow.
So the neocons saw this and basically said, look, we're playing by the rules, and they are actively encircling us.
But it wasn't just Europe, right? Because I'm seeing references to Angola and Ethiopia in the stack, too.
That's the other half of the trap argument. The Soviets were using Cuban proxy troops to support Marxist revolutions all over the developing world. The U.S. felt like they were watching the global map turn red, and their hands were tied by détente.
So the neocon view is essentially, we were suckers.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the final nail in the coffin was 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
That really seems to be the moment everyone points to.
It was the shatter point. When Soviet tanks rolled into Afghanistan, the whole illusion of peaceful coexistence just evaporated. For rising politicians like Ronald Reagan, this was the ultimate I told you so moment. Reagan viewed détente as a one-way street. His camp argued it gave the Soviets legitimacy and access to Western trade, while they just continued to repress their own people, like dissidents such as Andrei Sakharov, and invade their neighbors.
Okay, so that's the neocon critique.
Yeah.
But surely the realists, the people who actually built détente, they had a defense, right? They didn't just say, whoops, our bad.
No, not at all. The realist view, which is often called the Dove perspective, was that abandoning détente was totally reckless. Their argument was that treaties like SALT and the ABM Treaty were the only things preventing a bankrupting, completely destabilizing arms race.
And what about the human rights angle? Because I see the Helsinki Accords mentioned a lot, especially in IB history papers.
This is a really crucial nuance. The neocons hated the Helsinki Accords of 1975 because they thought it formalized Soviet control over Eastern Europe. It legitimized the borders. But the realists argued, no, look closer.
Right.
Helsinki forced the Soviets to actually sign a piece of paper agreeing to international human rights standards.
But did the Soviets actually follow those standards?
No, of course not. But the realists argue that wasn't the point.
Okay.
The point was that it gave dissidents inside the Soviet Union a legal framework. They could hold up that piece of paper and say, you signed this. You are violating your own laws. It delegitimized the regime from within. The realists firmly believed that engagement was a long game, and cutting off contact would just lead directly to war.
Well, looking at the timeline, the realists clearly lost that argument in 1980. Ronald Reagan wins the election, and we enter what historians call the Second Cold War.
And the temperature drops immediately. Reagan is not interested in relaxation. He wants to win.
The spending numbers here are just, they're eye-watering. A 13% increase in defense spending in 1982 alone.
It was the largest peacetime military buildup in history. Reagan basically took out the national credit card and went shopping. Stealth bombers, Trident submarines, the works. He wanted to show the Soviets that the U.S. could outspend and outbuild them indefinitely.
It wasn't just the money, though. It was the way he talked. The whole evil empire speech.
That phrase absolutely shocked the diplomatic world, calling the USSR the focus of evil in the modern world. You have to remember, for a solid decade, presidents have been walking on eggshells around Moscow. Reagan just walked in and kicked the table over.
And then he backed that rhetoric up with the Reagan Doctrine.
Right. Roll back. That was the new strategy. Not containment anymore. Roll back. The U.S. started aggressively funding anti-communist insurgents anywhere they could find them. Nicaragua, Afghanistan, Angola.
Yeah.
And it didn't really matter how unsavory these groups were. If they were shooting at Soviets or Soviet allies, they got American cash.
But the thing that really seems to have freaked the Kremlin out wasn't the insurgents. It was something that sounds straight out of science fiction. March 1983. SDI.
Star Wars.
Explain this to me like I'm 5. Because on paper, a strategic defense initiative sounds, well, defensive. Why did a defense program make the Soviets think Reagan was planning a first strike?
It all comes down to the logic of MAD, mutually assured destruction. For decades, the peace was kept because both sides effectively had a gun to the other's head.
Right. If I shoot you, you shoot me, we both die. It's simple, it's terrifying, but it is stable.
Okay, I follow that.
Now, SDI promised to build a space-based laser shield that could shoot down Soviet missiles. Imagine we are in that standoff. If I suddenly put on a bulletproof vest, the entire balance changes.
Oh, well.
If I have a shield and a sword, and you only have a sword, I can attack you and survive your counterattack, deterrence fails.
So the Soviets didn't see it as a shield at all. They saw it as the U.S. preparing to win a nuclear war.
They were terrified. They saw it as a purely offensive move to neutralize their deterrent. And that profound fear brings us right into 1983. The notes in our stack actually call this the year of apocalypse.
I feel like this year gets skipped over in a lot of general history classes, but looking at these events, we were incredibly close to the edge.
Arguably closer than the Cuban Missile Crisis, the tension was just palpable. In September 1983, you have the KAL-007 incident.
That was a civilian airliner.
Right.
Yes, a South Korean passenger jet. It strayed into Soviet airspace due to a navigation error. The Soviets, who were already hyper-paranoid about U.S. spy planes probing their borders, shot it down. 269 people died.
God, that's awful.
The U.S. called it a crime against humanity. The Soviets claimed it was a deliberate CIA provocation, and then, barely a month later, the U.S. invades Grenada to topple a leftist government.
So if you're sitting in the Kremlin in late 1983,
You are connecting the dots. You see the evil empire speech. You see the massive missile buildup in Europe. You see the invasion of Grenada, and you see Reagan building a space shield. The Soviet leadership genuinely believed Reagan was preparing for a surprise nuclear attack.
and it wasn't just the leaders who were scared. The public was absolutely terrified, too. We have a note here about the movie The Day After.
Oh, that movie was a massive cultural phenomenon. It came out in '83. It showed in really graphic detail what would happen to average Americans in the event of a nuclear war. Millions of people watched it. It was incredibly grim. And interestingly, it famously depressed Reagan himself.
Really? Reagan watched it.
Yes, he wrote in his diary that it left him greatly depressed. It's a really fascinating insight into his mindset. Reagan was talking tough publicly, but privately he was deeply afraid of the actual consequences of nuclear war.
So we are at rock bottom, end of 1983. The world is just holding its breath. And then the script flips. In March 1985, the Soviet Union gets a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev.
And this changes everything. You have to understand, the previous Soviet leaders were old, sick men who kept dying in office. Gorbachev was 54. He was energetic. And he walked into an absolute
The
mess.
economy, right.
Complete stagnation. The USSR was spending so much on the military just to try and keep up with Reagan that they couldn't feed their own people or produce decent consumer goods. There's a famous story where Gorbachev tells his wife, Raisa, "We can't go on living like this."
So he brings in two new policies that every history student needs to know. Perestroika and glasnost. I always mix these up. What's the difference?
It's easy to mix them up. Think of perestroika as restructuring. It's trying to fix the hardware of the Soviet economic machine, trying to make it more efficient, introducing some market-like reforms. Glasnost is openness. That's basically unmuting the group chat.
Right.
It allowed for criticism of the government, free speech, and transparency.
Which sounds great to us, but for a totalitarian regime, that's dangerous.
It's fatal. But Gorbachev felt he had no choice. He realized he could not win the arms race. He looked at Reagan's Star Wars program and knew the Soviet economy would literally collapse if they tried to match it. So he needed to end the Cold War to save communism.
And there was another huge event that pushed him toward disarmament, wasn't there? In 1986, Chernobyl.
A massive factor. The sources we have call it a dividing line in his life. When that reactor blew, it wasn't just an environmental disaster. It showed Gorbachev the utter systemic incompetence of the Soviet system and the horrific, tangible reality of radiation.
Yeah.
He realized that a nuclear war would basically be Chernobyl times a million.
So he starts making moves that no previous Soviet leader would even dream of.
Radical moves. He accepts the zero option, which meant eliminating all intermediate missiles in Europe. He formally withdraws Soviet troops from Afghanistan. He cuts off the money to those proxy wars in the developing world. He basically just stops playing the Cold War game entirely.
Which is wild. And this brings us to the real meat of the episode, the historiography. The why. We've got three main interpretations here in the stack, and this is where you IB students really need to tune in.
Let's break them down carefully.
First up is Interpretation A, the Reagan Victory School.
This is the view you'll very often hear in American conservative circles. The argument is incredibly simple. Strength works. Reagan's hardline policies, the massive defense spending, the absolute refusal to back down that is what broke the Soviet Union.
We have a quote here from Patrick Glynn. He says, the old Jimmy Carter approach of being nice just prolonged the Soviet Union's life.
Exactly. Glynn argues that by raising the stakes, sort of like in a high-stakes poker game, Reagan forced the Soviets to fold. They simply couldn't afford to stay at the table anymore. The argument is that if Reagan had continued with détente, the Soviet Union might have limped along for another 20 or 30 years.
It's a compelling narrative because it's clean. We pushed, they fell. But then we have Interpretation B, rapprochement.
Right, this is the it takes two to tango school of thought. This view argues that military pressure by itself wasn't enough. It was actually Reagan's willingness to change that mattered most.
Change how, exactly?
Well, look at historian Robert J. McMahon's argument in the sources. He gives Reagan credit not for being tough, but for being flexible. Reagan was a staunch, lifelong anti-communist, but he was willing to abandon those deeply held convictions to sit down with Gorbachev and actually treat him like a partner.
So it wasn't just the stick, it was the carrot.
It was the personal chemistry. If Reagan had just kept shouting evil empire and refused to negotiate, Gorbachev's internal reforms might have completely failed. Hardliners in Moscow might have overthrown him much earlier. It was Reagan's diplomatic engagement that gave Gorbachev the political space to dismantle the system safely.
Which leads us to the third perspective, Interpretation C. Maybe it wasn't really about Reagan at all, the Gorbachev factor.
This is the internal argument. It suggests that the Cold War ended primarily because of the Soviet Union's own internal rot and Gorbachev's specific brave choices. You could argue that even if a completely different president was sitting in the White House, the Soviet economy was still doomed.
So Gorbachev is driving the car, and Reagan is just in the passenger seat.
In this specific historiographical view, yes. But there's a really stinging critique here from historian Archie Brown that I think we absolutely need to highlight.
Is this about the victory lap?
Yes. Brown notes that American politicians like George H.W. Bush during the '92 election immediately framed the end of the Cold War as an American victory, as in, we won, they lost.
Why is that a problem, though? I mean, didn't we win in the sense that the USSR is gone and the West is still here?
It's a problem because of how it was received in Russia. Brown argues that by American politicians taking full credit, they fed a narrative in Russia that the Soviet collapse wasn't a natural failure of the communist system, but rather a U.S. orchestrated plot to destroy and humiliate their country.
Oh, wow. I see. So it fueled that sense of humiliation.
Precisely. It planted the seeds of deep resentment. If you treat the other side like a defeated enemy rather than a partner who actively helped end a dangerous conflict, you create a long-lasting grudge. Brown suggests that the Reagan victory narrative itself is partly responsible for the intense paranoia we see in Russian geopolitics today.
That is a really heavy thought. It
Yeah.
implies that the actual story we tell about history is just as important as the history itself.
I would argue it's sometimes even more important, especially for how it shapes the future.
So, bringing it all home, we get to the Malta Summit in 1989.
Bush and Gorbachev sitting on a ship in the Mediterranean, and the Soviet foreign minister famously declares that the Cold War is buried at the bottom of the Mediterranean.
From the near apocalypse of '83 to a burial at sea in '89. It is just an incredible turnaround.
It really is. And for our listeners, especially you students taking notes, remember the synthesis here. You can't just pick one single cause. You need the economic pressure highlighted by the Victory School. You need the diplomatic agility of the rapprochement school. And you absolutely need the internal bravery and reforms of Gorbachev. It's a complex puzzle, not a single lever you can pull.
Before we sign off, I want to leave everyone with a final thought based on that Archie Brown critique we just talked about.
Go for it.
We talked about how the "we won" narrative might have poisoned the well with Russia. It really makes you wonder if the West had told the story differently, if we had framed the end of the Cold War as a mutual victory for all of humanity over nuclear annihilation, rather than America defeating the Soviets. Would the map of the 21st century look different?
That's a great point.
Like, how much of the geopolitical tension we see in the news today is just a direct hangover from the victory lap we took in 1992?
That is the big question, isn't it? History doesn't really end, it just echoes.
Something to chew on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the end of the Cold War. We'll see you next time.